I have been making a very long essay about the history of sexuality. This is a reread. And I wanted to make a very short recommendation about the book and just talk about very, extremely superficially about its main arguments and themes. But I'm not gonna expand anything on the book because there is plenty of people with way more way more knowledgeable and that knows way more about this book and that actually prepares their videos in YouTube. You just need to type the history of sexuality if you want to deepen in the book, and you will find hundreds, not hundreds, but dozens of very good videos, long lectures, introductions. Just go to any of those and to all of those. It's a great place to start. I wouldn't go directly to the book unless you're already familiar with Foucault, with French philosophy, with post-structuralism, because it's a complex reading. I don't normally reread books. When I do, is almost always philosophy. I think the only book I have reread that is not philosophy is Fictions by Borges. But this book, even though it's very short, it builds in so many other concepts and themes from the history of philosophy that it's hard to grasp in a first read. Yet it is, I believe, very important. It's the number one seminal work of queer theory. And it has arguments that you will probably not have heard before if you are not familiar with the subject. It is very interesting to read. It's an extremely interesting reading, and it's extremely thought-provoking even if you completely disagree with Foucault. So what is the point of the book? What is he talking about? You have sort of like, this is a genealogy. It's not a... It's called the history of sexuality, but it's not history, and that's very important because, unlike in history, in genealogy you are not concerned with the actual facts about history. You are not tracing events that happened in a day, at a specific time, with a specific people in a specific room. But you are trying to trace normally the origin of concepts. To explain their background, how they were formed, and how they have come to be what they are now. In that sense, history is just an instrument for the genealogy, and it is not in any way subject to it. It can, what I mean is that you can moldate history in order to make a good genealogy. You can take what it's... and that is why Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals is an incredibly... is the best genealogy that has been written, probably. And yet, Nietzsche knew not much about history. He was... if he were a historian, his book would be crap. But he was not. And his book is also extremely thought-provoking, and it has some revelations in it that are fundamental for the world we live in to understand it. Yet I don't recommend going to Nietzsche because everyone goes to Nietzsche without having read anything else, and that is not that is not something that you should do. Okay, so the Genealogy of Morals. History of sexuality. The point is that sexual repression, sexuality, the concept of sexuality itself has a beginning. And it's not at the dawn of the Anthropocene, but in the Victorian era, where suddenly multiple sexual practices that had not yet been conceptualized became forced, they were forced to sort of be spoken about by multiple mechanisms in society, by multiple practices. It was the confession is the main one. Foucault writes at some point in this book. One had to speak of sex. One had to speak publicly and in a manner that was not determined by the division between illicit and illicit, even if the speaker maintained the distinction for himself. Yeah, so that is part of the book, is that historical account. But along with that, he's also making a differentiation between two forms of repression. And he's explaining why one is way more important than the other, even though we tend to not give almost any relevance to the latter, to the former. So these two forms are repressive power and normalizing power. Repressive power, it's the form of power that everyone knows. The form of oppression that everyone knows is when a country forbids homosexual practices. You know, you go to Saudi Arabia and you have homosexual practices and you will be killed. You will be executed for whatever your inclinations are. That is repressive power. But as relevant as that is, repressive power itself is not what keeps people from limiting their sexual potential or the sexual desires, from not doing sexual practices that are considered inadequate for humans. You don't sleep with your dog, not because it's on the law, but because it is not normal, because you could not even conceive to sleep with your dog, right? So that is the normalizing power. When the Supreme Court of India says you should not homosexuality is illicit, the fact that they're saying that it's illegitimate or illicit or anything like that, it's basically saying that it is sort of like it's a structure that has been adopted into the it is a practice that has been adopted into the framework of the state, and it has concluded that it doesn't accord to the standards of efficiency and rightfulness that system holds. But normalizing power is different. Normalizing power is when you have a kid that is playing with his sister's doll, and the parents question him about it, and like, you should not be playing with the doll of your sister, the doll's house of your sister, whatever. And then an idea is implemented, even if it's not explicitly said. An idea is implemented in his mind. Boys don't play with girls' toys. That idea will be adopted as a simple truth, and it will be in most cases unreflectively communicated to others and kept as obvious, as self-evident. That is an example, but again, the dog example is another one. Like, you grow up and you are told, you are not even told. There are some things that are assumed not to be adequate or normal. They don't accord to normality. So this in terms of sexuality, this concept of sexual normality is what Foucault is saying, that didn't exist before the Victorian era, between the sort of like 18th, 19th century, 17th, 18th, 18th, 19th century. And it was sort of brought out through the practice of the confession. Then that practice had many other, like once once it was sort of like spoken out loud in public, explicitly, then the system had finally had the capacity to make mechanisms to limitate that practice or to make it productive, because that's all that in sort of like Foucault's theory, that's all that the system does. It is a machinery of productivity, it is a machinery of creating efficiency. Levi-Strauss in the Elementary Structures of Kinship would talk about how marriage, the rituals of marriage, are really just as a transaction that would happen from father to future husband of a woman, of a virgin woman. She would have to be virgin to, and that would sort of like be a confirmation of the father's honor, because it means that he did not rape her. So she would be exchanged for with the exchange given to the husband in exchange for land. This is an exchange that is at the root of the institution of marriage, and it shows that, and it shows how a practice that is seen as moral or sacred, it really was just subject to concepts of economy, to efficiency, to values that go way beyond the sacred of the divine or anything like that. I mean, like, you can get Spinoza arguing that the Bible itself is a political text. I think it's a very interesting book, a very interesting thesis from Spinoza's side, but maybe not so relevant for now, so let's not digress. So, therapy, the confession, there's many other practices in schools. You get the same thing. You're supposed to talk about those things that are not normal and that you're practicing, so that the system can create mechanisms to repress that, or mechanisms to treat that, or mechanisms to pathologize. And that's the point. I just got completely lost. I think that is the sort of like the main point of the book is that the normalizing power pathologizes that which is not normal. It creates the abnormal, but it's only by looking at the periphery of what it considers regular, at the periphery of what's normal, that the normal can be sort of like confirmed. That's very Hegelian in a sense. If you get someone to confess that they like having sex in public, and it's confessing about that, by knowing that that person does that and knowing that most people doesn't, they both identify the normal in contrast with the abnormal, and then they create all and then those practices that I talked about are created to treat that which society considers as an aberration. But that aberration, that thing that is considered abnormal, it's only so because it is not productive for the system. It's only so because in the sort of like is for the values of a system that requires a certain kind of efficiency, a certain kind of structure and functioning. Those practices are not plausible or beneficial. And lastly, I would say that what is also very interesting is that this is not, there is a beginning, there is sort of like a value, there is also like a premise, there's a logic behind all of this, right? Behind the confession, behind almost every interaction, there would be a logic, but that logic is not perpetrated consciously by any single individual or authority of any kind. It is located everywhere. It is just a pattern of the motion of society. No one was like, let's make people confess their desires so that we can repress those that are not adequate for society. It just happened. And even even there is no elites or anything like that you can point at and say, okay, these people is the ones that are self-creating the normalizing power, unlike the repressive power, which is truly which can be sort of like, you can point down the people who induce or who like enforce the repressive power, the president, the elites, the owner of this multinational, the teacher, the father, the whoever. The normalizing power is not created by any single individual. The first tyrant in the normalizing power is the person who's its victim, because they themselves identified, they themselves othered themselves, they see themselves as other from normality, and within themselves, in themselves has also been cultivated the seed of wanting to be normal. So either they repress those practices or they estrange themselves from society. For that reason, it is not only more interesting but also way more rooted in every society as a form of sexual repression. That is the main theme of the book. I think that would be a summary of it. On power, I'm gonna read one paragraph from my essay just to sort of like clarify what power is. So I wrote, this incitement to sexual discourse was an attempt to classify those forms of sexual behavior that did not benefit the goals of power. But what is power? Now, quoting Foucault from page 94 of this book, power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared. Continue. And power is not exercised by a figure like the capitalist, who is the clear nemesis in Marxism, for example. Power is, for Foucault, continuing from the previous quote, exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. Now, in order to illustrate what this means, one might look at Hitler's regime. Whether or not that regime had a centralized power, Hitler himself was not the Third Reich. And one could not explain the millions of compartmentalized forms of oppression over the Jewish people by just looking at him. Oppression in this sense is not the result of individual action, but a kind of symbiosis. Moreover, millions of people were trapped in the power nets that could not be located in any specific place, person, or artifact. Thus, when Foucault writes, power relations are both intentional and non-subjective, what he means is that there is a logic behind them, and yet that there seems to be no individual creator of that logic which is articulated, as mentioned above, from countless points, and therefore impossible to locate its source. Western man has indeed become a confessing animal, that I say, quoting Foucault from page 59, and in his confession finds his penance, this being, quoting Foucault again, the infinite task of extracting from the depths of oneself in between the words a truth which the very confession holds out like a shimmering mirage. Now I'm just gonna read the conclusion. To conclude, even those who are its most ardent participants are far from being the engineers of the power relations. This is what I was talking about before. So, you don't have engineers. Every single person becomes a participant and a victim of the normalizing power, and only those, which are not many, who are truly normal in their sexual practices, in everything else by extension, are not a victim, but only participants. Because power is not a fixed point or a structure, and for that reason, not even the analogy of the hamster wheel appears to be correct, because wheels don't change their geometry. Only the thing does. Only the thing does. The source of power, that which is here and yet not nowhere, and yet everywhere. This is what is meant by intentional non-subjective, once again. In everyone and yet nobody resides the logic which is the pattern left behind the mechanic motions of power relations, and that is the discernible aspect of this omnipresent dynamic. I think this is an extremely revealing book because it, contrary to common belief, it argues that talking about the things that you do and that you feel ashamed of makes you free. Contrary to that belief, he argues that precisely like talking about them is giving them up to the system in order to create mechanisms to oppress you from doing those things. Whether or not you agree with that, let me know. I think it's a very, very interesting thesis, and it's very well argued. And yes, that's it. This is definitely a recommend. This is one of my favorite philosophy books of the last year.